Tom, the moderator. There.
You can put it right here.
You have another microphone?
Are we on the air? We certainly are. Thank you. I'm Tom Ray. I'm Assistant Chairman of Berkeley Music Synthesis Department at Berklee College of Music in Boston. And our panel today comprises Mr. Mathews, who just gave a very eloquent lecture on the origins of the use of the digital computer for synthesis. Another pioneer, a tool maker for us on the end, Dr. Robert Moog, and two of the preeminent practitioners, modern-day practitioners of this art, Laurie Spiegel, Don Slepian. We don't have a real fixed format, but I thought I would invite Dr. Moog to comment about, first, sort of the evolution of his end of the thing from the analog side, and make some comments on that, and then invite Mr. Mathews to any follow-up on his comments, and then Laurie and Don with an idea about what this actually means to the performing artist or sculptor or performance artist, musician. And so, without further ado, if Bob would take it away.
Mike. Oh boy. I'll give you a very personal point of view. When I was a kid in high school, building electronic musical instruments was a hobby of mine. Now, most of you in this room are familiar with computers. You know that inside a computer is a very high-tech assemblage of hardware that it takes a major corporation and a lot of bucks and time and engineering to put together. You wonder how a high school kid can be fooling with electronic hardware as a hobby. Well, back then, back 35, 40 years ago, electronics was incredibly more simple than it is today. You just can't imagine how easy it was to put something together that made a sound. And, from a creative person's point of view, an interesting sound. Maybe not from a conventional musician's point of view, but certainly from a creative person's point of view. So that was my gratification. I was just naturally comfortable with the soldering iron in my hand, listening to what came out over a loudspeaker when you stuck the probe of the amplifier into various parts of the circuit. In fact, even before I did musical instruments, the radio repairman at the time had a test device called a signal tracer. I don't see them around anymore. All a signal tracer is a cheap little amplifier with a little detector in the front, so that even if you have RF, very high frequency in the circuit, this will demodulate it and extract that part of the variation in the RF that you can hear. And I really had a visceral feeling for what was going on in a couple of tubes that was picking up WQXR or one of those stations in New York City. I could hear in my own mind what the signal sounded like as it went through more clearly than I could hear anything else, more clearly than I could reproduce, say, a Chopin nocturne in my head, which was what I was supposed to be reproducing in my head. I took piano lessons, too. So that's what it was like for electronic tool makers of my generation. I don't think anybody my age who was working back in the 50s and 60s had a different experience. It simply wasn't. There were no ICs, there were no computers, and in fact, there was very little of anything that was manufactured. You bought the parts yourself, put them together, and it didn't work, and then you had to find out why. He went after me. Another person who was doing the same thing, he was considerably ahead of me, was Harold Bode. Bode was a young engineer back in before the Second World War. He was a young engineer in Germany and had developed quite a few experimental keyboard-oriented musical instruments, especially for the Cologne radio. He came to this country after the Second World War and got a job with the Este Organ Company in Brattleboro, Vermont, designing what were supposed to be commercial products. It's a little bit early for them to be successful commercial products. But in his basement, he was experimenting with new sound-producing devices that were used by the likes of the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center, ring modulators, frequency shifters, and so on. And it was Bode who first put together an analog modular system. It wasn't a complete analog modular system, but I remember the article in Electronics magazine. It was in 1961, and there was a picture of Harold Bode with this relay rack on the table and half a dozen modules, one of which was a tape recorder transport with the tape going around in a loop with several playback heads, so you could diddle the distances between the playback heads and change the echo thus produced. And there was something that we would today call a voltage-controlled amplifier or a programmable amplifier, and a couple of other things, I don't remember what, but there it was, a modular system. And since I can remember it to this day, I certainly remembered it when I began, which is about 3 or 4 years after I saw that article. And I think I'll stop here, Tom. I think that's, for me, that was the roots. I became aware of other roots as I got into it. I became aware of Kedoff's work in Rome and Don Buchler's work on the West Coast. But for me, it was doing these one-note organs that popped up in hobbyist magazines and theremins and stuff that was you could get to work on some basis, and then being shown the light sort of by Harold Bode.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like next for Mr. Mathews to address a concept that if you think about the evolution from acoustic instruments to electric instruments, we've gone from instruments that were essentially completely hardware-based, meaning made up of constituent elements, physical things, where form follows functions. You certainly don't expect to get a gong sound out of a clarinet, and vice versa, to instruments, if you will, that are now software-based in the broadest sense of the word, meaning that the configuration of the instrument is due to some intelligence, either on the part of the designer or the player. I think this has a certain implication, possibly. Most violinists of the past certainly didn't build their own instrument before they started playing. But now I think there is perhaps an implication for this in the future, and maybe Mr. Mathews would like to discuss that.
Well, I'll discuss that a little bit, and then I also want to ask Bob a lot of questions, which I've always wondered about back from the early days of tape music and modular synthesizers. I guess one of the things that has always surprised me was the interest and what I consider enormous foresight of certain composers in computer music, because the initial sounds that came out, which you heard this morning, were anything but inspiring. So why did they not simply say, well, gosh, this is crazy, and go back to their own work? And I guess the reason for that was a theoretical, maybe there were two reasons. One was a theoretical reason that some mathematicians, Black and Shannon, proved that you could make any sound from numerical samples. And the composers believed that theory. Now, it's taken us a long time not to make any sound, but to make really good sounds. And so the composers had to have faith for a very long time. The composers that gave us the most encouragement in developing the computer music were Vladimir Usichevsky, who I am sure interacted plenty with Bob at the beginning, and Milton Babbitt, and Edgar Varese. None of these three composers really used the computer in their own music, with the possible exception of Usichevsky, who did come out and struggle with the computer for a sabbatical term. He came and worked at Bell Labs. The other reason that tape composers might have been interested in the computer was simply its potential for labor saving. Tape music could be very, very laborious if you had a piece which involved a lot of tape splicing. And the computer had the possibility of doing that splicing for you, even if you didn't use it for any other purpose. So when Usichevsky came to the labs, he wasn't much interested in the synthesis programs which I had written. He wanted what was called a super splicer program, and persuaded one of the people, Sandy Posansky, to write that program for him, so he could have a lot of recorded sounds in the computer and put them together very cleanly and very, very rapidly, and also without accumulating tape noise. Well, now, I'd like to lead up to the questions which I hope Bob can enlighten me more on. I think both he and I came into the music field at a time when the leading edge of one kind of music was tape music. And tape music originated in Europe, I think primarily in Paris and in Cologne, where Pierre Schaeffer and Karlheinz Stockhausen worked on two different kinds of tape music. Schaeffer's tape music, which now corresponds to what we would call sampling, involved recording live sounds and then processing them with tape recorders, doing the things one can do with tape recorders. Stockhausen's music consisted of recording oscillators and then processing them with tape recorders. The two different schools, I think, were more acrimonious than they needed to be. And this difference has been echoed today in synthesizers, which are either sampling synthesizers or synthesizing synthesizers. And again, I think it's a sort of a stupid argument. I think both kinds have their place and both kinds have their problems. And the good music will come out of people who can take advantage of the techniques they're using and avoid the disadvantages. In the early days, there weren't any special oscillators or special equipment that were built for musicians. And getting scientific oscillators or Heathkit oscillators and being able to record the sounds and to change the frequency of the dials and do things musically interesting with them or filter the sounds was a very sort of messy, laborious job. Often just getting a patch cord which would go from the output of an oscillator to the input of a tape recorder might take a half an hour and a soldering iron. So making a set of modules which had standard patch cords, and so you could connect one to another easily, was, in my opinion, no small advance to the field. And I had always blamed that on you, Bob. And so it was a little revelation that you are now blaming part of it, at least on Boda. And I'm not sure that I go along with that. I'd always blamed it on you, and I've never known exactly whether Buchla found it from you or whether he made a modular device independently. But anyhow, I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's something which I also made in Music 3. These were computer programs which were modular, in a word. The so-called building blocks, many of which were exact duplicates or exact analogies, I guess is the word, of what Bob had in the physical synthesizers, i.e. oscillators and mixers and attack and decay units and things like that. And of course they should be, since we were really both making, in the end, the same kind of sounds. And but the really nice thing was that both of us allowed the user, or forced the user, whichever way you want to look at it, to build his own instruments out of these building blocks which we supplied. Now, voltage control is something that I'd be interested in your comments on. How, when that came along, when one could control the frequency and the amplitude and the characteristics of filters with voltages rather than with twisting knobs, because that really was a revolution in terms of control and what one could achieve with control. Another innovation is when were keyboards related to these kind of equipments. My feeling at the beginning was that there were not keyboards, or they had to be sort of attached separately. Another question concerns sequencers and how they came in. I continue to be very interested in sequencers, but not what I'll call raw sequencers, simply playback predetermined series of notes, but sequencers that let one perform or interpret series of things which now mostly are in the computer memory. I still think that sequences of the right sort are the way in which much interesting music is and has to be described. Well, have I asked enough questions at the moment?
Am I on again?
Question, yeah.
Okay. We should get on to the musicians sooner or later, I think. Voltage control. That fell out of the electrical characteristics of the silicon planar epitaxial transistors that were just becoming available in the mid-1960s. and it sounds funny to rattle off that, but that was the buzzword back then. Not only that, but they were cheap. You could buy one of these transistors for $0.25. If you bought 1,000 of them, you bought the cheapest grade possible. Otherwise, they cost $2 a piece, and 5 years before that, they cost $30 a piece. So for a bag full of what were basically rejects, you could put together several voltage-controlled oscillators or voltage-controlled amplifiers, and if you did the simplest possible circuit, the gain of the amplifier or the frequency of the oscillator would vary exponentially in response to the control voltage that you applied to it. As to why voltage control in the first place, the first musician I worked with, Herb Deutsch, had a little Sony tape recorder, and he had already struggled with the Heathkit oscillators and the laboratory filters and whatnot. And he was frustrated that the sounds he was hearing in his mind just moved faster than he could heft those knobs around. And it seemed to me that if we generated electrical vibrations from a low-frequency oscillator or an envelope generator, that might overcome Herb's objections to stuff with just knobs on the front panel. What was next? Keyboards. Herb and I were just having a good time together. I built a couple of voltage control oscillators, literally on the kitchen table. They weren't accurate at all, and they weren't very wide range, but they did, when you hook the output of one into the control input of the other and then listen to that second one, you would hear these wild, distinctly electronic textures, and that excited her. Put those right on tape and took it from there. After a while, I guess he was looking for a super splicer too, because splicing is a time-consuming business, and he wanted to know how about making changes electrically in the sound instead of having to splice them together by tape. And I had an old keyboard lying around, so we tried that. And really, all that keyboard was to turn the sound on and off, and either to get a high sound or a low sound. Herb was not interested in harmony or melody. He was interested in pitch only as one aspect of tone color. A high sound had a different timbre than a low sound. Now, that was his view. Now that particular view of the electronic music medium cost us dearly, because here we had this keyboard, and 999 out of 1,000 musicians looking at that keyboard expect some very specific pitches to come out, and they didn't. Other pitches came out. And in fact, the pitches that came out depended very much on the time of day and the temperature of the room. And just the way Bush hammered away at Dukakis for being soft on murderers and rapers and whatnot, so ARP pounded away on us for our drifting oscillators 3 or 4 years later. I mean, that was one of their two big issues. The other one was the messy patch cords. Okay, that's the keyboard. I mean, that's not the whole story, but that's the flavor of it. Sequencers, we copped our sequencer from Buchla. It's as simple as that. And it's my understanding that he and Subotnick developed his idea of the analog sequencer with all the knobs on the front panel in collaboration, and two of them together.
I can add about that. Don Buchla has told me that he developed the sequencer as a replacement for tape loops because he'd been getting repeating sequences of sounds by making tape loops, splicing all these little pieces together, and he ran them enough and they'd begin falling apart and stuff, so he decided to do it electronically.
Okay. I'm through.
Wasn't there a third question?
That was it.
I think we should hear from Don and Laurie.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, why don't we hear then from the practitioners of the art, Laurie Spiegel first, and then Don, whatever topic you'd like to address.
Never been called a practitioner before. Yeah, there are a couple of points I wanted to make about some of these early days, because there are a fair number of assumptions that are actually quite different that wouldn't be obvious to people coming into things at this point. I hadn't really thought about the concept of small computers quite that way until Max brought out this paradox of size versus functionality inversely changing. But what did we have in that DDP-224? Was that 32K? It was about the size of, a third of this room, perhaps. 8K of core were the size of perhaps a refrigerator-freezer combination, and if it stopped working right, you kicked it. And there were all those probes hanging out, trying to simulate what later became a frame buffer on the one that Lily and Ken were using, and it was really kludge city. One of the results of having such small memory, I think when those hard disk drives came in, Dick Moore said, gee, we've got a whole meg of hard disk storage. How are we ever going to fill up a meg of information? I mean, this is like some I think it might have been Dick, but it was things were different at that time, and in part because of the memory limits, and in part because that was a pure research environment. Certain assumptions were commonly made about the purpose and the orientation of this, which are worth just briefly mentioning. One is the idea of economy. It was very important to be extremely economical in what one did. Resources were quite limited, but also there was a scientific mental set. In a way, I think many of us were looking for the unified field theories of music and sound. We wanted to find the smallest number of the most general generalities sufficient to give the greatest possible amount of freedom while using the existing resources the most economically. This is like a mental set which is non-existent when you look at 362K sequencers for the Macintosh and massive allocations of resources toward currently accepted standard tasks. The idea, which I've probably been most involved with, of viewing the computer essentially as a decision-making machine, a logical machine, rather than just a storage medium or labor-saving. Well, it's a form of labor-saving device, but it is related to the idea that the most economical description of a piece of music might be a description of the decision-making process involved in creating it. And that idea, which I think I really probably got from Emmanuel Gant and other people floating around the lab during that period, has been really quite dominant for my work. In the timbral domain, of course, Max's music languages have a generality which is still not practical in real time, unfortunately, in many of the things that are out there. But there were, I was not one of them, but there were a large number of people willing to trade off the real-time interactivity for much greater, truer freedom to do absolutely anything with sound. And the idea of freedom was a very dominant and important idea, which I really don't see floating around too much. There's a lot of emphasis on realism. The first question asked just about any new synthesizers, how's your string sound and how's your piano sound? But in terms of what can I discover that I've never heard before, which has incredible expressive potential, and that's not a common question, but it was an extremely common question in those days. It was the purpose of working many times harder than you needed to with traditional media in order to get something not nearly as good as an output. The reason for having to go through all of that was to go beyond what was available. There were plenty of wonderful oboists around if you needed an oboe sound, but there were aspects of music possible that had never been heard. And this was a shared mental set by a small community of crazy people which is really quite different now that many people are using computers and taking them for granted as essentially labor-saving devices or more low-cost ways of doing things. Now, I'm not against the use of computers to simulate traditional things because obviously a general system needs to be able to simulate traditional as well as new things, and it's probably the best test of generality to be specific in the ways that we're accustomed to hearing things. And also because most things we still don't understand. I mean, one thing that was constantly being discovered over and over and over is how little we understand about how we hear, how we perceive, what makes music meaningful. We were not experts. Everybody was doing everything for the first time, and if you wanted an envelope, you had to write an envelope generator. If you wanted to be able to change that decay slope, you had to write a routine that let you go in and do that. You had to actually really work hard for everything. About the groove system, one of the most important characteristics, which Max didn't mention, which I think is worth mentioning because he didn't have time to mention everything, was because it was a hybrid system, and I'm sitting here right in the middle of a hybrid situation with analog on that side, digital on that side, was that it represented music, and in fact, whatever you wish to use it for. I used to use it for controlling graphical output to a frame buffer as well. But it essentially was a system for the composition of perceptually continuous functions of time. It was not event-oriented in the ways we've come to take for granted with either the conventional notation system or MIDI. It described all sound components and all compositional components as patterns on perceptually continuous, like 100 or 200 hertz sampling rate time functions, of which it hypothetically could handle a lot more than it ever really did in reality, which was usually not more than 14. Anyway, if you wanted a note, you had to basically synchronize changes in two time functions. One output through a digital analog converter with a 10-turn pot on it, which you hand calibrated every time you went in, which controlled amplitude of an analog oscillator, which were often wavetechs in the beginning, as they're the most precise ones, and another voltage used to control the frequency. Now, you would then have one time function, which would be a stepwise staircase thing, which would represent your pitch patterns, and another one, which would then be envelopes, which you would have to compute or enter some other way. Editing was extremely problematic, and people were always trying to write. Well, Manny was constantly, forever coming up with more and more ways to try to edit an envelope and not end up with a discontinuity at the end of the edit point without having to go in and hand edit every sample numerically by typing the number. I mean, it was really quite cumbersome. But the fact that it was a set of continuous functions of time meant that at any point in this step-stair discrete set of pitch changes, you could easily put in glissando, portamento. There was actually only the superimposition on continuity of the experience of discrete changes, but that was it was not necessary to deal in any kind of event-oriented or discrete step musical space. That was just a construct set up within a continuous space, and I think that's an important point to remember, which comes out of analog, voltage analog thinking, and math on the other side, of course. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that basically I think everyone involved in the field really, really loved it, and most of all of our friends thought we were crazy. Awful lot of musicians felt we really were dehumanizing things, and it was very difficult to get them to understand that this was, in fact, a vision we hoped would lead someplace as good as the old places. I know that's about all I have to say. Don, you have a different perspective because you did maybe stuck a little closer to the music than I, who got off in software land rather heavily.
Well, actually, the difference is that I was more in hardware land, and you were more in software land. But otherwise, certainly electronic sound and electronic music it's just a lifelong fascination for me. I think the biggest event was spring of 1960, when my father brought home Music from Mathematics. And this was a 12-inch long-playing record from Bell Labs. Some of the things, actually, one of the pieces we heard, the one shortly after, Max, your numerology, if you remember that piece. Well, I wore that record flat, of course. Loved it. I did build an early analog modular system in 1963, which has no historical impact whatsoever. Well, it's the truth. It consisted of 3 oscillators, and the oscillator was a small electric motor you get out of a toy, connected in series with a battery, and that in series with a loudspeaker. Put a battery to the motor to speaker, and the motor starts turning, and you hear this whine, and the motor, as the motor is traveling, it makes a tone. So I had 3 of these motors, 3 batteries, 3 speakers. And with my fingers, I would press down on the shafts of the motors. Pressing down on the motor shafts would change the pitch. So that's how I changed the pitch of the oscillators themselves. Now, the other hand, in order to change timbre, I would press on the speaker cones, and that would be my filtering function. So this is my 3rd grade science project. And my teacher didn't know what to make of that, but I don't know how much application that is today, other than just the point you were making, Bob, that it really was very easy to work with. It was easy to build and to work with musical electronics in the 60s, certainly compared to today. The overhead of just getting a microprocessor system up and knowing that is a whole different thing than making a 3-transistor circuit or the things I was building 25 years ago. I did start on building reverb units and modifying electronic organs and all that sort of stuff until much of my history is just have been very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. And one of the important influences on me was working the summer of my senior year in the Groove output room at, actually this wasn't Groove yet, but this is the computer music output room at Bell Laboratories, where I was exposed first to computer music and the early Moog modules, the ideas of synthesis, and also composers such as Jean-Claude Risset, also to illusions such as the Shepard tone phenomena and illusions of circularity of relative pitch. I think there's on Sunday we'll be having a talk about that, about psychoacoustics. All of this started, I came into the music part of it around 1971 when I started on the large modular ARP 2500, which is this big, long affair with all these little switches that you would control an enormous machine. Back then, the truism was that sound was considered to be plastic. It was this plastic substance that you would sculpt away. You'd generate with these oscillators these rich, buzzy timbres, and then you'd come in with the filters, and you'd be just like sculpture, like chipping away at marble. You'd use the filters to sculpt the sound and to get exactly the timbre you want. Set up envelope generators, one by one, oscillators one by one. The machine I worked on, again, the ARP 2500, had 13 oscillators, 4 filters, 2 sequencers. It was an enormous machine. But if you think today of an SQ80, for instance, or most any modern synth has enormously more just plain hardware. The difference is that we were working with far less. Before, Laurie, you were talking about computers with 32K address spaces and tiny little memory. Well, also in hardware, back in the modular systems of the early 70s, had maybe 2 notes worth of sound by today's modern standards. And a different sort of mindset was really, see, today when we go to a synthesizer, you're looking among the 128 presets or whatever. You're picking preset number 57. Maybe you go in and modify it if you're particularly adventuresome. Very few people would do it from scratch. Even myself, if I have a new instrument today, I go into factory presets and I modify, I change, I customize it, and we call it tweaking the sounds, of course. You make it fit for yourself. But you start with a tremendous amount of given. Whereas working 20 years ago with the analog equipment, it was a matter of really starting from scratch each and every time. The guiding light for me was Wendy Carlos's work, Switched on Bach, which is the moment the day I heard that, I knew somehow or other, and I had no idea how, but I was going to run into a synthesizer, and that's what my life would be about. I'd be wrapped up in that. And I count myself very fortunate to have had the opportunities I've had. All during the 70s, I worked with analog and worked this sort of way, the way most of us did. Then at the end of the 70s, in 79 actually, I came back to Bell Labs and first did work with Music 5. And after a few months of working, some of it struggled, but I still have some music I made with that. Actually, when I say struggle, the other side of it was tremendously educating. It's very, very valuable. I think every musician should be in some point in a compositional language environment. You should learn how to put oscillators together, whether it's physically or whether it's in software. I know I have not seen or constructed or worked with these instruments the same after my experience with Music 5. I also think of nights at Bell Labs where I would be working on 15 seconds of music. And generally, a computational run would take approximately 5 to 10 minutes. So I would work on my score, I'd do a final edit, and I also put in instructions that once the computer has finished computing, I wanted it to play it. So I'd put it into the computer, put in my edit, I'd go off to the floor, I'd fall fast asleep. 5 minutes later, the computer would wake me up with the music that I had just edited. I'd go to the terminal, I'd make all my edits, all my changes, put it back in again, fall back asleep. This is 3 o'clock in the morning. This is the time to work at Bell Labs. And cycle round and round, if you can imagine, a couple of hours of that. That's the sort of dedication that you were talking about, that everyone here has talked about. Part of being a pioneer is spending a couple of nights, all night, just going back over the 15 seconds of music, having the machine wake you up and work on this program. And it's always, it's both a frustration and a tremendous privilege to have these tools. Speaking as a musician, it is, what can you say? Without it, we have these machines, these pianos, violins, and so on. They're always in our hands, but these new instruments, that's exciting, and they really bring forth new possibilities for music. What happened after Music 5 for me was the real-time system. The first real-time digital synthesis system at Bell Labs was designed by H.G. Alice. The Alice machine was a 300-pound, large-sized box, but it would fit on maybe half the table here. It was made of an LSI-11 microcomputer mentioned earlier, along with 1,200 other ICs, approximately 7 fans, 3 keyboards, foot pedals, joysticks, a variety of other things. And in there was my first experience with compositional algorithms, which are a very powerful way for a musician to compose. Algorithmic composition's been around for hundreds of years. Certainly Mozart and other people of his ilk did throw dice to make music or did all sorts of musical games. The composer has in the computer a tremendous ally, a tremendous co-worker in realizing algorithms or realizing the vision that's in your mind. And just today, just now, we're getting the first generation of commercial programs put out by Intelligent Music and other companies. Small group of people, one of them here to my right actually, putting out tools available to all of us on to have microcomputers, the ability to use algorithms, the ability to do things other than simply, I have this melody in my head and I'm going to put it down on paper. It's really to interact with a score as it performs, to use the powers of the computer to create something new, whether it's either directly or this idea of algorithm I think of as a recipe, to have a plan of composition. I worked with the Alice machine, and currently I'm still doing hardware work on real time. By that I'm meaning I'm building a performance system, a system where you can play all of these instruments live without using a sequencer. And the way I'm doing that currently is by expanding foot pedal controls, doing all the MIDI patching with my left toe, doing all the mixing with my right foot, and so on. Trying to increase the bandwidth between a human being and a computer, so that a single person in real time can control a digital orchestra. I'm sure no matter what I'm doing 10 years from now, I'll still be working with music and electronics and computers. It's fascinating and a wonderful field. It's not mentioned here, but before and even today, it's a difficult field to make a living. It's not, I mean, certainly you know that. It's obvious if you're a pioneer in something, you're here because you love it, because you have a dedication to the music as a craft and to these new tools as a possibility to expand that craft.
Thank you, Don. Would any of our panel participants like to respond to what someone else has said, first of all? Yes? No? We have a very few minutes. I'd like to throw it open to the audience to ask some questions. I will repeat the question because we are making a visual record of this. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The question is whether or not Harry F. Olson with the RCA synthesizer in 1955 had an impact on either Dr. Moog's or Mr. Mathews' work. Do you want to respond to that?
Actually, I think Olson's work was ahead of my work, substantially ahead, and I didn't know about his machine until, maybe 1960, but that was just because I hadn't gotten to look at it. I consider it was a real tour de force in many, many ways. It made rather good timbres using filtering techniques. It had a semi-digital control system. It was digital in the pitch dimension and analog in the time dimension, basically. It just was a really wonderful machine, and some of the early examples were incredible from it. To my mind, only one composer really came to terms with it, and that was Milton Babbitt. It was a tough machine to use, as was early computer music and all these things for many reasons that we now understand. But I just have the greatest admiration for the machine, and also for many of the other things that Olson did. He was a very broad person.
I don't think Bob wants to say anything, but I would like to add just something to that, since history is one of my sidelights. In actual fact, that was a paper tape encoded machine in 1955. In actual fact, automata goes all the way back to the invention of clockwork, and there was a paper tape encoded machine at the Paris Exposition of 1929 that would play 4 lines. The Coupeau-Guillelet electrical oscillation type, was patented and so forth. And if you go back through the patent literature, I think the critical thing to understand, or at least my view as a historian, is who is dead first at something is rarely really very important. As a matter of fact, I have it on fairly good information that the inventor of the oscillator was not the guy that got the patent, but it doesn't matter. And I think it's important to keep in mind, the tentacles, where something goes, whose shoulders are we standing on? The giants in the industry are the people who have had the big inroads into either success, if you want to put it in those terms, or widespread appeal and some things like that. As a matter of fact, my topic at the noontime luncheon is extension of this entire pioneer concept with the prehistory, if you will, of all this kind of stuff. It's unfortunate that a lot of people don't make connections in our field. They don't connect, for instance, that Morty Feldman and John Cage and people like that actually did their early work in the likes of studios like Lewis and B.B. Barron, who did Forbidden Planet's film score, one of the very first sci-fi kinds of things, or that they did some mixes in R.H. Ranger's studio, who invented the Ranger tone organ in 1935 that played 6 heterogeneous lines and some things like that. Or that Boda's instruments were also in the Cologne studio, and that Troutwine's instruments were in the Cologne electronic music studio. We don't really have enough appreciation for the fact that I think Karl-Heinz Stockhausen was quoted as saying, electronic music didn't fall out of the sky with the Moog synthesizer when it kind of became popular. Yeah, he did, as a matter of fact. And if he didn't, would you know? I mean, it makes a great story. No, I think there was a certain amount of justifiable, not bitterness, but just comment that, well, this thing has a history, and I felt like telling Mr. Stockhausen, that's right, it didn't fall out of the sky in Germany in 1951 either. It goes way, way back. I mean, the impetus or the impulse to do these things goes back several centuries into doing these things. But certainly, Dr. Olson, that was an important thing, if only for one thing, to stir up the musicians' union. It had a very instrumental effect that way. You might tell that story, Walter's story. That might be fun.
Okay, it's a bit of a tangent. What I was going to say was that I wasn't particularly aware of the RCA synthesizer when I began. It was closeted in a studio in one of the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center studios. Wasn't generally available to just idly curious people. But every now and then something did appear about it in the newspapers. And what I remember most was the story that Olson foresaw that this development might be used for commercial recordings, and that they actually produced some pop music on it. One of the bass lines they produced was just a little too good, and was hell to pay. The musicians' union made an incredible ruckus about it, and since RCA also had a record company, a very big one at that time, they backed off from further exploitation of the RCA sound synthesizer. The story that Tom's talking about was in the late 60s, and the musicians' union again raised a ruckus, and in fact negotiated a contract with the commercial music producers in New York City, excluding by company name the use of the Moog synthesizer in any work. From this point of view, from this right now, it could be interpreted that way, but it was not welcome then. We had a big backlog then that was suddenly got very small. Our New York distributor, who was also a member of the musicians union, a very good tuba player, took his instrument down to the musicians' headquarters and to argue the case of the company, set this big modular system up, and he got a very dull-sounding patch on it, and he played it, and he said, "You see," to the musicians' union officials, he says, "You see, this is nothing more than a bad Hammond organ. That's all it is." And eventually, the restriction on the use of the Moog synthesizer was rescinded.
I know that Alan Nikolai put out
First.
I'm wondering if that would be the extent of any work you might have done with him, or if you really did work with him.
The question is regarding Alwyn Nikolai, who had the first Moog synthesizer that was sold. Of course, Herbert Deutsch had the prototype, Moog synthesizer. Oh, excellent. Do you want to talk about Alwyn Nikolai then? Or?
Yeah. Collaboration was very informal. I got to see how he worked. I can't remember exactly what the collaboration was, but I'm sure I made some suggestions and I got some requests from him to do things further. As with most of our customers at the time, he began small because we weren't making that many different modules. And over the years, he added to the system, and a lot of what he added, we designed in response to his requests a year or two before.
Looking for the collaboration between Max and Bob and Hugh LeCain.
The question regards the Canadian pioneer, Hugh LeCain, who, as early as 1948, had developed a synthesizer-like instruments and some other things, and whether or not Mr. Mathews and Dr. Moog had collaborated.
I didn't really know about LeCain until almost the end of his career, when he gave a talk in New York City, a really great talk. And then I went up and visited him and saw some of his instruments, which are indeed remarkable. He's had a posthumous influence on me. I believe, unfortunately, that most of his instruments essentially died with him. There may be one or two copies left, but they're unlikely to be replicated. And the moral that I draw from this is that unless you get your instruments in production by some company, they aren't going to survive you.
Dr. Moog?
Max and I never collaborated. I was way behind his work. And in fact, one spring, I applied for a job at Bell Labs, a summer job. And Max and I actually had a conversation, talked about what I would do if I came to work for Bell Labs. The first I knew of LeCain's work was what I saw at the University of Toronto Electronic